Baby eagle fell from its nest. During a storm, farmer discovered what its sibling did overnight. The wind came without warning that evening, rolling across the valley like an iron fist. Thomas Brennan stood at the kitchen window of his farmhouse, watching the oak trees bend and thrash against the bruised sky. He had lived in Montana for 43 years, raised cattle and crops through droughts and blizzards, but something about this storm felt different. The air tasted metallic. The clouds moved too fast, twisting in on themselves with a kind of violence that made his chest tighten. His wife, Caroline, called from the living room. "Tom, come away from the window. That lightning's getting close." He didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the ridge beyond the north pasture, where a pair of bald eagles had nested in the tallest pine for the past 3 seasons. He'd watched them through binoculars all spring, first the courtship dances, then the careful construction of the massive nest, and finally, in late April, the arrival of 2 eaglets. He'd never told Caroline how often he climbed the hill just to watch them. It felt foolish, a grown man obsessed with birds, but there was something about the way the parents worked together, the way they took turns hunting and guarding, that moved him in a way he couldn't explain. The storm hit full force just after 9. Rain came in sheets, horizontal and blinding. The power went out. Thomas lit 2 oil lamps and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the house groan and creak around him. Caroline went to bed early, but he stayed up, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and stay with us. At dawn, the world was still. The storm had passed, leaving behind a strange, cathedral-like silence. Thomas pulled on his boots and walked outside. The yard was littered with branches, shingles, and debris. One of the barn doors hung crooked on its hinges. He'd deal with that later. First, he needed to check the cattle. He was halfway across the north pasture when he saw it, a small, dark shape in the wet grass near the fence line. His heart sank. He broke into a run. The eaglet was alive, but barely. It lay on its side, one wing twisted at an unnatural angle, its chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. Its downy feathers were soaked and matted with mud. The bird was maybe 8 weeks old, still covered in grey-brown juvenile plumage, not yet ready to fly. Its yellow eyes were half-closed, clouded with pain and shock. Thomas knelt beside it, his knees sinking into the soft mud. He'd seen injured animals before, calves born wrong, horses with broken legs, and he knew the look of something that wouldn't make it. But this was different. This was a wild creature, a symbol of something bigger than his farm, bigger than himself. He couldn't just walk away. He carefully scooped the eaglet into his hands. It was heavier than he expected, all bone and muscle beneath the wet feathers. It didn't struggle. That was a bad sign. He tucked it gently inside his coat and stood, scanning the ridge. The pine tree was still standing, but even from this distance he could see the nest, or what was left of it. The storm had torn away nearly half of the massive structure, leaving it lopsided and exposed. Caroline was making coffee when he came through the door. She turned, saw his expression, and immediately set down the pot. "What is it?" He opened his coat. Her hand went to her mouth. "Oh, Tom, is it—" "It's alive, barely." They cleared the kitchen table and laid the eaglet on a folded towel. Caroline, who had grown up on a ranch in Wyoming, moved with the same calm efficiency she'd shown 100 times with orphaned lambs and injured dogs. She examined the wing, gently probing the joint. The eaglet flinched but didn't cry out. "It's dislocated," she said. "Maybe broken. Hard to tell without an X-ray. Can we help it?" She looked at him, and he saw the doubt in her eyes. "We need to call someone. Fish and Wildlife, maybe, or a raptor center." Thomas nodded, but he knew what that meant. It was Saturday. The nearest wildlife rehabilitation facility was 4 hours away in Bozeman. By the time someone arrived, the eaglet might be gone. And even if it survived, even if they could save it, what then? Would it ever fly again? Would it be released back into the wild, or would it spend the rest of its life in a cage? Caroline must have read his thoughts. She put a hand on his shoulder. "One step at a time, Tom. Let's keep it warm and hydrated. Then we'll make the calls." They fashioned a makeshift nest from a cardboard box lined with old blankets. Caroline used an eyedropper to give the eaglet water mixed with a tiny bit of sugar. It swallowed reflexively, a good sign. Thomas sat beside the box, watching the shallow rise and fall of its chest, and for the first time in years, he prayed. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the storm clouds. The farm came back to life, the cattle lowing in the distance, the chickens scratching in the yard, the wind moving through the trees like a long, slow exhale. But inside the farmhouse, time seemed to stop. Thomas and Caroline moved quietly, speaking in whispers, as if the slightest noise might tip the balance between life and death. It was nearly noon when Thomas thought about the nest again. He grabbed his binoculars and walked back to the north pasture, climbing the small hill that overlooked the ridge. He trained the lenses on the pine tree. The nest was in ruins, just as he'd feared, but it wasn't empty. The second eaglet was there, huddled in what remained of the structure, its head tucked low against the wind. It was larger than its sibling, its feathers more developed. It sat perfectly still, almost statuesque, as if waiting for something. Thomas lowered the binoculars, his throat tight, one fallen, one left behind. He wondered if the parents had returned yet, if they'd noticed the damage, if they knew one of their young was gone. Eagles mated for life, he knew. They returned to the same nest year after year. This was their home, their family. He stood there for a long time, watching the lone eaglet on the ridge, and felt the weight of something he couldn't name pressing down on his chest. Nature was brutal. He'd always known that, but it was also beautiful, fiercely and terribly beautiful, and sometimes the two were impossible to separate. When he returned to the house, Caroline had news. She'd reached someone at the Montana Raptor Conservation Center. They could send a volunteer, but not until Monday morning, 2 days away. "We'll have to keep it alive until then," she said. Thomas looked down at the box, at the fragile creature struggling to breathe, and nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." The first 24 hours were the hardest. Thomas and Caroline took shifts through the night, one sleeping while the other kept watch over the cardboard box in the kitchen. The eaglet's breathing remained shallow, its body temperature difficult to regulate. Caroline had read somewhere that young birds needed warmth, so they placed a heating pad wrapped in towels beneath one side of the box, creating a gradient so the bird could move away if it got too hot. It didn't move much at all. Thomas sat in the wooden chair beside the makeshift nest at 3 in the morning, the house dark, except for the single oil lamp on the counter. His hands cupped a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He watched the eaglet's chest rise and fall, counting the breaths like a meditation, 32 per minute. That seemed fast, but he didn't know if it was normal or a sign of distress. The house settled around him with its familiar creaks and sighs. 40 years he'd lived here. 40 years of morning chores and evening routines, of seasons that rolled past like freight trains, each one the same and different. He and Caroline had raised 2 children in this house. Both were grown now, living in cities on opposite coasts, pursuing careers that had nothing to do with farms or Montana or the land their grandfather had homesteaded in 1947. Thomas didn't resent them for leaving. He understood. The world had changed. But sometimes in moments like this, alone in the dark with only the sound of his own breathing and the faint rustle of feathers, he felt the weight of being one of the last generation to work this particular soil, to know these particular hills, to watch these particular eagles return each spring. His father had shown him the nest when he was 8 years old. They'd hiked up to the ridge together on a summer morning, his father carrying a pair of binoculars that had belonged to Thomas's grandfather. The nest had been smaller then, just a few years old, but already impressive. A platform of sticks and branches 3 feet across, perched in the same pine tree. "Eagles build their nests bigger every year," his father had said, adjusting the focus on the binoculars. They come back to the same spot, add new material, raise their young. Some nests get to be 8, 9 feet across, heavy as a car. Thomas had been mesmerized. He'd watched the adult eagles soar and dive, their white heads brilliant against the blue sky, and felt something shift inside him. A sense of connection, of continuity. These birds had been here before him. They'd be here after. "Why do they come back?" Thomas had asked. His father had thought about it for a moment. Loyalty, I suppose. Or memory. Maybe both. Eagles mate for life, Tom. They choose a partner and a place, and they stick with it. There's something to be said for that. Thomas was 61 now. His father had been gone for 15 years, but he still hiked up to the ridge every spring, still watched the eagles through those same binoculars, still felt that same sense of wonder, and now one of their young lay broken in a box in his kitchen, and he didn't know how to save it. Caroline came down the stairs at dawn, wrapping a cardigan around her shoulders. She looked at Thomas, then at the eaglet, and read the answer in his face before he could speak. No change. No change. She moved beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. They stood together in the grey morning light, two people who had spent 40 years learning each other's silences. "You should get some rest," she said gently. "I'm all right. Tom, I need to check the nest. See if the parents came back." Caroline nodded. She knew better than to argue. She'd learned long ago that her husband processed worry through motion, through the act of walking and observing and doing. He needed to see the ridge, needed to know that the other eaglet was still alive, still waiting. Thomas pulled on his coat and boots and walked out into the cool morning. The storm had scrubbed the air clean, leaving everything sharp and bright. He crossed the pasture, climbed the familiar hill, and raised the binoculars. What he saw made his breath catch. Both adult eagles had returned. The male perched on a branch above the damaged nest, his white head turning slowly, scanning the ground below. The female stood in the nest itself, her massive wings partially spread over the remaining eaglet. Even from this distance, Thomas could see the protective posture, the way she curved her body around her young. But there was something else, something that made Thomas's hands tighten on the binoculars. The surviving eaglet was awake and alert, standing upright in the nest, and in its beak it held something, a fish, a small trout, silver and still fresh. Thomas watched, transfixed, as the young eagle tore at the fish with surprising dexterity, pulling away small pieces and swallowing them. The mother eagle stood nearby, watchful but not interfering. This wasn't feeding time. The eaglet was old enough to feed itself. But where had the fish come from? Thomas panned the binoculars slowly across the nest. There, near the edge of the remaining platform, he saw 2 more fish, small ones, carefully placed. His mind worked through the possibilities. The parents had brought food. That was normal, but the quantity seemed unusual. 3 fish for 1 eaglet, when typically the parents brought just enough for immediate needs, and the placement lined up almost deliberately at the edge of the nest, as if they'd been meant for 2. Thomas lowered the binoculars, his heart hammering. Eagles were intelligent birds, he knew. They recognized their offspring, their mates, their territory. But did they understand loss? Could they count? Could they know that one of their young was missing and still bring food for both? He stood on the hill for a long time, watching the eagle family go about the business of survival. The male took flight, his wingspan enormous as he caught an updraft and circled higher, scanning for threats. The female remained in the nest, occasionally adjusting her position, always keeping the eaglet within reach. And the young bird ate, gaining strength, growing larger and stronger with each passing hour. Nature's math was simple and cruel. One survives, one falls. The strongest thrives, the weakest dies. But as Thomas watched the mother eagle carefully position herself between her remaining eaglet and the wind, as he saw the male return with another fish and drop it gently into the nest, he wondered if there was more to it than that, more than just instinct and survival, something that looked almost like grief. He walked back to the farmhouse slowly, his mind heavy with thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. When he entered the kitchen, Caroline was at the stove, scrambling eggs. The eaglet was still in its box, still breathing. "The parents are back," he said. Caroline turned. "And the other one?" "Alive, eating." She nodded, reading the complexity in his voice. "And this one?" Thomas knelt beside the box. The eaglet's eyes were open now, just slightly, tracking his movement. That was new, that was progress. "Fighting," he said quietly. They spent the rest of the day in careful routine. Caroline used the eyedropper to give the eaglet water every 2 hours. Thomas researched eagle diets on Caroline's laptop, something he rarely used, and learned that young eagles at this age needed protein, preferably raw meat or fish. He drove to town, bought fresh trout from the market, and cut it into tiny pieces. At first, the eaglet wouldn't eat. It turned its head away, too weak or too frightened, but Caroline was patient. She held a small piece near its beak and waited, speaking in a low, soothing voice. After nearly 20 minutes, the eaglet opened its mouth and accepted the food. Thomas felt something crack open in his chest. "There you go," Caroline whispered. "That's it. You're stronger than you look." By evening, the eaglet had eaten 3 more pieces. Its eyes were brighter. Its breathing had slowed to something closer to normal. The wing was still damaged. They'd need professional help for that. But the immediate crisis seemed to have passed. Thomas sat in his chair beside the box as the sun set, painting the kitchen in shades of amber and gold. He thought about his father, about loyalty and memory, about the eagles on the ridge, and the one in the box, and the invisible threads that connected all living things. "You're going to make it," he said softly, more to himself than to the bird. "I don't know how yet, but you're going to make it." Outside, darkness fell over the farm. And on the ridge, in the broken nest, the other eaglet settled in for the night, surrounded by food it couldn't eat alone, watched over by parents who hunted for 2, but fed only 1. Sunday morning arrived with a mist that clung to the valley like cotton wool. Thomas woke before dawn. He'd managed 3 hours of sleep on the couch and immediately went to check on the eaglet. It was standing. Not just awake, but actually standing in the box, balancing on both feet despite the injured wing hanging awkwardly at its side. "Caroline!" he called up the stairs, his voice tight with emotion. "Caroline, come see this." She appeared moments later, still in her nightgown, and stopped in the doorway. A smile broke across her tired face. "Well, look at you," she said softly, approaching the box. "You've got some fight in you after all." The eaglet watched them with sharp, alert eyes. Its head moved in quick, jerky motions, tracking their movements with the intense focus of a predator. Even injured, even displaced from everything it knew, the bird radiated a kind of fierce dignity that made Thomas's throat tighten. They fed it again. More trout, cut into slightly larger pieces this time. The eaglet ate eagerly, its appetite returning with its strength. Caroline checked the wing as best she could without causing distress. The swelling had gone down slightly, but the joint still didn't move properly. They'd need that specialist from Bozeman tomorrow. After breakfast, Thomas did what he'd done every morning for 40 years. He walked the property, checked the cattle, inspected the fences, noted the storm damage that still needed repair, but his mind wasn't on the work. It kept drifting back to the ridge, to the nest, to the question that had haunted him since yesterday morning. What was happening up there? Were the parents still bringing food for 2? Was the surviving eaglet thriving or struggling? He found himself climbing the hill again, binoculars in hand. The mist was lifting, burned away by the climbing sun. As he reached his usual vantage point, he trained the lenses on the pine tree. What he saw stopped him cold. The nest was empty. Thomas's heart seized. He panned left, right, scanning the branches, the ground below, the surrounding trees. Nothing. The adult eagles were gone. The surviving eaglet was gone. The nest sat abandoned, the pile of fish from yesterday still visible at its edge. Had something happened? Had a predator attacked during the night? Had the parents abandoned the damaged nest entirely? He was about to lower the binoculars when movement caught his eye. There, on the ground, perhaps 40 feet from the base of the pine tree, something moved in the tall grass. Thomas adjusted the focus, his hands trembling slightly. It was the eaglet, the surviving one. But it wasn't flying. It couldn't fly yet, not for another few weeks at least. It was on the ground, hopping awkwardly through the grass, its wings spread for balance. And in its talons, it clutched something. A fish. Thomas watched, barely breathing, as the young eagle made its way towards something he couldn't quite see from this angle. The bird moved with purpose, dragging the fish through the wet grass, stopping every few feet to rest. It was exhausting work for a bird not meant to be on the ground, vulnerable to predators, exposed. What was it doing? Thomas moved, carefully, quietly, circling around the hill to get a better angle. He stayed low, using the natural terrain to remain hidden. The last thing he wanted was to spook the bird or interfere with whatever was happening. When he reached the new position, he raised the binoculars again and finally understood. There at the base of the pine tree, partially hidden by fallen branches and debris from the storm, was the broken eaglet's original landing spot. The trampled grass where Thomas had found it 2 days ago. And the surviving eaglet was heading straight for it. Thomas's breath came shallow and fast. He watched as the young bird reached the spot and stopped, looking around with sharp, deliberate movements of its head. It dropped the fish in the grass. Then it opened its beak and made a sound, a high-pitched, piercing cry that carried across the valley. It was calling for its sibling. The sound cut through Thomas like a blade. He'd heard eagles cry before, the adults' high-pitched chatter, the juveniles' begging calls. But this was different. This was urgent, desperate, searching. The eaglet called again, then waited, its head cocked as if listening for a response that would never come. Thomas felt tears sting his eyes. He lowered the binoculars and wiped his face with the back of his hand, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Grief, maybe, or recognition, the acknowledgement of something he'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. The surviving eaglet knew its sibling was missing. It had climbed down from the nest, a dangerous, exhausting journey for a bird that couldn't yet fly, and brought food to the last place they'd been together. It was searching, waiting, refusing to accept the absence. Thomas watched for another 20 minutes as the eaglet remained at the spot, occasionally calling out, occasionally pecking at the fish as if to demonstrate that food was available. Finally, the young bird seemed to give up. It left the fish where it lay and began the arduous journey back toward the tree, hopping and flapping through the grass. Thomas waited until the eaglet was halfway up. Young eagles could climb remarkably well using their talons and beaks before he moved. He approached the spot where the fish lay and knelt down. It was fresh, probably caught by one of the parents that morning. The eaglet had carried it all this way, through grass and debris, exhausting itself in the process. For its sibling. Thomas picked up the fish carefully, wrapped it in a plastic bag from his pocket, and stood. He looked up at the ridge, at the pine tree where the eaglet was slowly making its way back to the damaged nest, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. He'd spent his whole life around animals, cattle, horses, dogs, chickens, wild creatures of every kind. He knew they felt pain, fear, hunger. He'd seen horses grieve for lost companions, dogs pine for absent owners, cows bellow for separated calves. But this deliberate act of searching, of bringing sustenance to a place associated with loss, of refusing to forget, this felt different, more complex, more achingly familiar. When he returned to the farmhouse, Caroline was cleaning the eaglet's box, having moved the bird temporarily to a larger plastic bin lined with soft towels. The eaglet stood in its new container, looking stronger by the hour, its eyes bright and alert. Thomas set the bagged fish on the counter. Caroline looked at him, saw his expression, and put down the cloth she'd been holding. "Tom, what happened?" He told her everything, the empty nest, The eaglet on the ground, the fish, the calling. Caroline's hand went to her mouth. "Oh, my God!" "It came down to look for its sibling," Thomas said, his voice rough. "Brought food to where it fell. It's been doing this. I'd bet anything it did it overnight too when we found those extra fish in the nest. It's been trying to feed its brother." Or sister," Caroline said quietly. "Or sister." They stood in silence, both looking at the injured eaglet in the plastic bin. The bird looked back at them, head tilted, processing these strange, tall creatures that had taken it from everything it knew. "They're more than we give them credit for," Caroline said finally. "Aren't they?" Thomas nodded. "A lot more." The rest of the day took on a different weight. Every time Thomas fed the injured eaglet, he thought about its sibling on the ridge, climbing down with fish, calling into the emptiness. Every time he checked the bird's improving condition, he wondered what it would mean when they returned it to the wild. Would the siblings recognize each other? Would the bond still exist? Or had the separation, the different experiences, already changed them into strangers? That evening, Caroline suggested something that had been forming in Thomas's mind, but that he'd been afraid to voice. "We should bring the fish up there," she said, "the one its sibling brought. Put it back in the nest." Thomas looked at her. "You think it matters?" "I think it tried to feed its brother for 2 days. The least we can do is acknowledge that." So as the sun began to set, Thomas made the climb one more time. The mist was returning, rolling down from the mountains in slow waves. The surviving eaglet was in the nest, huddled against the coming night, the parents nowhere in sight, likely roosting in a nearby tree. Thomas approached quietly, reverently, as if entering a sacred space. He placed the fish at the edge of the nest platform, near where the others had been. The eaglet watched him with keen eyes, but didn't flee. Maybe it recognized him somehow. Maybe it simply understood, in whatever way eagles understand, that he wasn't a threat. "Your brother's alive," Thomas whispered. "He's going to make it. I'm going to make sure of it." The eaglet blinked slowly, a gesture that felt like acknowledgement. Thomas climbed back down and stood at the base of the pine, looking up. The nest was a dark silhouette against the dimming sky. The lone eaglet was a smaller shadow within it. Somewhere in the farmhouse below, the other eaglet stood in a plastic bin, growing stronger, healing. Separated by distance, but connected by something deeper than instinct. Something that looked a lot like love. Monday morning came with clear skies and a cold wind that promised an early winter. Thomas was up before 5, unable to sleep, checking on the eaglet every hour like a father with a newborn. The bird's recovery had been remarkable. In just 3 days, it had gone from near death to standing strong, eating eagerly, even attempting to spread its wings, though the injured one still hung wrong, a constant reminder of how far they still had to go. The volunteer from the Montana Raptor Conservation Center wasn't due until noon, but Thomas found himself watching the driveway from the kitchen window, coffee cup in hand, as if he could will the vehicle to arrive sooner. Caroline was at the table, reading from a printed stack of papers she'd downloaded the night before. Information about eagle rehabilitation, wing injuries, release protocols. She'd always been the researcher in their partnership, the one who needed to understand every detail before making a decision. "It says here that juveniles this age can recover from dislocations if treated within the first week," she said, not looking up. "But there's risk of permanent damage if the muscles atrophy or the joint heals wrong. So we're still in the window." "Barely. Tom, we should prepare ourselves for the possibility that it might not fly again." Thomas set down his coffee cup harder than he intended. "It's going to fly." Caroline looked up, her eyes soft with concern. "I want that too. But we need to be realistic." "It has to fly," Thomas said, his voice rough. "Its sibling is up there waiting, bringing it food, calling for it. If this one can't go back, if it has to spend its life in some enclosure—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Caroline stood and crossed to him, taking his hand. "We'll do everything we can, but some things are beyond our control." He nodded. But the tightness in his chest didn't ease. He'd spent 3 days watching this bird fight its way back from the edge of death. He'd seen its sibling risk everything to search for it, to feed it, to refuse to give up. The idea that all of that courage, all of that devotion, might end with permanent separation felt unbearable. At 11:30, a white pickup truck with the Raptor Conservation Center logo pulled into the driveway. A woman in her early 30s stepped out, pulling on a pair of thick leather gloves. She had dark hair pulled back in a braid, and the confident, economical movements of someone who'd done this work 1,000 times. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan," she called, approaching the porch. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm a wildlife veterinarian with the center." Thomas shook her hand, surprised by the firm grip. "Thank you for coming all this way. It's what we do." She smiled, but her eyes were already moving past him toward the house. "Where's the patient?" They led her to the kitchen, where the eaglet now occupied a larger crate they'd borrowed from a neighbor, something originally meant for transporting hunting dogs. The bird stood alert, watching the newcomer with keen, suspicious eyes. "Doctor." Chen approached slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice. "Hey there, beautiful. Let's see what we're dealing with." What followed was the most meticulous examination Thomas had ever witnessed. Dr. Chen worked with astonishing gentleness, her hands steady and sure as she extended the injured wing, palpated the joint, checked the bird's overall condition. She measured wingspan, examined feathers, looked at eyes and beak and talons. The eaglet tolerated it all with remarkable patience, as if understanding that this strange human was trying to help. Finally, Dr. Chen sat back on her heels and looked up at Thomas and Caroline. Her expression was carefully neutral. "Tell me," Thomas said. "It's a shoulder subluxation, partially dislocated. The good news is there's no fracture. The socket is intact. The bad news is it's been 3 days, and there's already some muscle stiffness setting in." "Can you fix it?" Caroline asked. "I can reduce the dislocation, pop it back into place, but the bird will need rehabilitation. Physical therapy, essentially. Controlled exercise to rebuild the muscle strength and range of motion. That usually takes 4 to 6 weeks. Thomas's heart sank. 6 weeks. Dr. Chen stood, brushing off her knees. That's the minimum for a bird this age to safely return to the wild, and that's assuming everything goes perfectly, no setbacks, no complications. The bird would need to be in a flight rehabilitation facility where we can monitor its progress. "Where's the nearest facility?" Caroline asked. "Our main center in Bozeman. We have aviaries large enough for eagles to practice flying, staff trained in raptor rehabilitation, everything needed for proper recovery." Thomas looked at the eaglet, then out the window toward the ridge. 6 weeks. A lifetime for a young bird that should be learning to hunt, to fly, to survive. And its sibling. What would happen to the bond between them after that much time? Would the other eaglet even remember? "There's another option," Dr. Chen said carefully, following his gaze. "It's not something we typically recommend, but given the circumstances." "What option?" Thomas asked. "We could do the rehabilitation here, on your property. I'd need to come back every few days to check progress and adjust the treatment plan. You'd have to build a temporary enclosure, something large enough for the bird to exercise, but secure enough to protect it from predators. And you'd need to commit to the daily therapy routine. It's labor-intensive, and there's no guarantee of success." Caroline looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the eaglet. "But it could stay close to its nest," he said slowly. "Close to its family." Dr. Chen nodded. "That's the advantage. Eagles are social birds. They learn from observation. If the parents and the sibling are nearby, it might actually aid in the rehabilitation process. The motivation to rejoin them can be powerful." "We'll do it," Thomas said immediately. Caroline touched his arm. "Tom, we should discuss." "We'll do it," he repeated, looking at his wife. "We have the space, we have the time. And that bird up there, its sibling, has been climbing down from the nest every day trying to feed it. If there's any chance we can get them back together, help them be a family again, we have to try." Dr. Chen smiled for the first time, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. I was hoping you'd say that. Most people wouldn't take this on. It's a lot of work. We've raised calves, foals, orphaned fawns, Caroline said, resignation and determination mixing in her voice. I suppose an eagle isn't that different. Dr. Chen laughed. Oh, it's completely different. But you've got the right spirit. They spent the next 2 hours working out the details. Dr. Chen reduced the dislocation, a procedure that made Thomas wince despite the local anesthetic she'd brought. The eaglet squawked once, a piercing cry that seemed to echo across the valley, but then settled as the joint slipped back into place. There, Dr. Chen said, wrapping the wing in a specialized bandage that would limit movement while allowing some circulation. That's the easy part. Now comes the real work. She sketched out plans for the rehabilitation enclosure on a piece of notebook paper. It needed to be at least 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, 8 feet high, wire mesh on all sides and top, perches at varying heights, a sheltered area for weather protection, nothing sharp or dangerous, everything designed to let the bird move and exercise without risk of re-injury. Where would be the best location? Caroline asked. Thomas didn't hesitate. The north pasture, near the base of the ridge, close to the nest. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. Perfect. The bird needs to see its family, hear them, maintain that connection. It'll make reintegration much smoother. She left detailed instructions, feeding schedules, exercise protocols, warning signs to watch for. She'd return on Thursday to check progress. In the meantime, they had 3 days to build the enclosure and begin the rehabilitation process. After Dr. Chen drove away, Thomas and Caroline stood in the driveway, looking at each other in the afternoon light. Are we crazy? Caroline asked. Probably. 6 weeks is a long time. A lot can go wrong. A lot can go right too. She smiled, shaking her head. When did you become such an optimist? Thomas thought about the eaglet on the ridge, climbing down with fish in its talons. He thought about the injured bird in his kitchen, fighting its way back to life. He thought about his father's words from so many years ago. Eagles mate for life. They choose a partner and a place, and they stick with it. I'm not an optimist, he said quietly. I just believe in finishing what you start. And we started this when I picked that bird up from the grass. Now we see it through. Caroline took his hand and squeezed. Then we'd better get to work. That enclosure won't build itself. They spent the rest of the day gathering materials, wire mesh from the barn, posts from the lumber pile, tools from the shed. Thomas called their neighbor, Jim Hutchins, who came over with his truck and helped haul everything to the north pasture. When Jim heard the full story, the fallen eaglet, the sibling bringing food, the plan to rehabilitate and release, he insisted on helping with construction. I'll be over at sunrise tomorrow with my tools, Jim said, his weathered face serious. This is important work you're doing, Tom, real important. As the sun set, Thomas made one more trip to the ridge. The surviving eaglet was in the nest, silhouetted against the orange sky. The parents were nearby, roosting in adjacent trees. The family was intact, but incomplete. 3 more days, Thomas whispered to the gathering darkness. 3 days, and your sibling comes home. Close enough to see you, close enough to hear you. We're going to put your family back together. The eaglet shifted in the nest, and for just a moment, Thomas could have sworn it was looking directly at him. Acknowledgement, agreement, hope. He walked back to the farmhouse with purpose in his stride, plans forming in his mind. Tomorrow they'd build. The day after, they'd strengthen, and then, the real work would begin, the work of healing, the work of reunion, the work of proving that some bonds once forged could never truly be broken. Dawn broke cold and bright on Tuesday morning, the kind of crystalline autumn day that made everything seem possible. Thomas was already in the north pasture by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, marking out dimensions with stakes and string. Jim Hutchins arrived at 6:30 with his son Danny, a quiet teenager who worked with the focused intensity of someone twice his age. "Where do you want us?" Jim called, climbing out of his truck with a toolbox in each hand. Thomas pointed to the staked area. 20 by 10, 8 feet high. Dr. Chen said the bird needs room to hop and flap without hitting the sides. By 7, they had the corner posts sunk deep and plumb. By 9, the frame was taking shape. Sturdy 2x4s creating a skeleton that would hold the wire mesh. Caroline arrived mid-morning with thermoses of coffee and a box of sandwiches, and stayed to help stretch and staple the mesh to the frame. It was hard, meticulous work. Every edge had to be secured, every potential gap closed. One sharp wire could re-injure the healing wing, one weak point could let in a predator. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, barely stopping to eat. Other neighbors appeared as word spread through the valley. Old Ben Martinez brought extra wire cutters and work gloves. The Kowalski twins, retired teachers who lived 3 miles south, showed up with a truckload of scrap lumber for purchase. Even Sheriff Dawson stopped by on his patrol, took off his hat, and spent an hour helping to frame the sheltered corner that would protect the eaglet from wind and rain. "Heard what you're doing," Dawson said, hammering a support beam into place. "My daughter's in veterinary school. She'd love this story. Mind if I take a few pictures for her?" "Go ahead," Thomas said, surprised by the swell of emotion in his throat. He'd lived in this valley his whole life, known these people for decades, but there was something profound about seeing them all come together for an injured bird. In a world that often felt fractured and rushed, this felt like something essential, something true. By late afternoon, the enclosure stood complete. It was sturdy, spacious, and positioned perfectly, just 30 yards from the base of the pine tree, where the nest perched high above. From inside the enclosure, the injured eaglet would have a clear view of its family. From the nest, the surviving eaglet would be able to see its sibling. Dr. Chen had been right. Proximity mattered. They lined the floor with wood chips and clean straw. Jim and Danny constructed 3 perches at different heights, low enough for a bird that couldn't fly, high enough to provide exercise as healing progressed. Caroline hung a water basin from one corner and positioned a feeding platform near the sheltered area. It was nearly dusk when they finally stood back to assess their work. "That'll hold," Jim said with satisfaction. "That'll hold through anything." Thomas shook his hand, then pulled his neighbor into a brief, rough hug. "Thank you, all of you. This wouldn't have happened without—" "Don't mention it," Jim interrupted, his own voice thick. "We take care of our own in this valley. And I figure that includes eagles, too." After everyone left, Thomas and Caroline walked back to the farmhouse to prepare for the most delicate part, moving the injured eaglet to its new home. The bird was stronger now, more alert, but still fragile. They'd need to transport it carefully, minimize stress, make the transition as smooth as possible. Dr. Chen had left a specialized carrier, a soft-sided crate with ventilation holes and padded interior. "You ready for this?" Caroline asked, looking at the eaglet standing in its larger crate. Thomas took a breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." He approached slowly, speaking in the low, calm voice he'd used for the past 4 days. The eaglet watched him, head tilting in that characteristic raptor manner. Thomas reached in carefully, supporting the bird's body with both hands, mindful of the wrapped wing. The eaglet's talons gripped his gloved hand with surprising strength, a good sign of returning vitality. "That's it," he murmured. "Easy now. We're taking you home, taking you back to where you can see your family." He transferred the bird to the carrier and secured the opening. The eaglet settled inside without struggle, as if understanding that these strange humans had been helping all along. The walk across the property felt ceremonial. Thomas carried the crate with exaggerated care, Caroline walking beside him with a flashlight as the last light faded from the sky. The valley was quiet except for the evening sounds. Cattle settling in the lower pasture, a barn owl calling from somewhere in the cottonwoods, the whisper of wind through dry grass. When they reached the new enclosure, Thomas paused. Above them, barely visible in the gathering darkness, the nest was a dark mass against the darker sky. He thought he saw movement up there, the surviving eaglet, perhaps watching them, drawn by the sound of voices. "Here we go," he said softly, opening the enclosure gate. Inside, he set the carrier down and carefully opened the front panel. The injured eaglet stepped out, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. It took in its new surroundings with quick, sharp glances, the mesh walls, the perches, the open sky above. And then it looked up toward the ridge, toward the nest, toward home. The eaglet opened its beak and called, that same high-pitched, piercing cry Thomas had heard days before. The sound cut through the twilight, urgent and unmistakable. "I'm here. I'm here. I came back." For a long moment, there was only silence. Thomas held his breath, Caroline's hand finding his in the darkness. And then, from high above, an answer. Another cry, higher-pitched, almost frantic with excitement. The surviving eaglet had heard its sibling. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face and didn't bother to wipe them away. Beside him, Caroline was crying too, her hand squeezing his so hard it hurt. The two eaglets called back and forth for several minutes. A conversation Thomas couldn't translate, but understood nonetheless. Recognition, relief, joy. The wounded bird hopped to the nearest perch and spread its wings as far as the bandage would allow, calling again and again toward the nest above. "They remember," Caroline whispered. "After everything, they remember each other." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. They stayed until full darkness fell and the calling finally subsided. The injured eaglet settled onto the lowest perch, its body angled toward the ridge, its gaze never leaving the direction of the nest. Even in the darkness, even exhausted from the move, it maintained that vigil, waiting, watching, connected. The next morning, Thomas was at the enclosure before sunrise. He'd barely slept, too anxious to see how the eaglet had handled its first night in the new environment. As he approached, he saw the bird standing alert on the middle perch. It had climbed higher during the night, testing its strength. But what stopped Thomas in his tracks was the sight beyond the enclosure. The surviving eaglet was on the ground again. It had climbed down from the nest in the pre-dawn darkness and stood just a few feet from the wire mesh, a fish clutched in its talons. The two siblings were as close as they'd been since the storm, separated by only a few feet and a barrier of wire. Thomas watched, transfixed, as the healthy eaglet pushed the fish through a gap in the mesh near the ground. The injured bird hopped down from its perch and approached cautiously. It reached through the wire and took the offering, pulling it inside the enclosure. They were feeding each other, across the barrier, despite the separation. The bond hadn't just survived, it had strengthened. Thomas backed away slowly, not wanting to interrupt the moment. He returned to the house and told Caroline what he'd seen. They sat at the kitchen table, coffee forgotten, trying to process the depth of what they were witnessing. "I've never heard of this," Caroline said, her voice full of wonder. "Eagles bringing food to an injured sibling, maintaining contact like this." "Dr. Chen needs to know," Thomas said. "This is important. This is unprecedented," Caroline finished. When Dr. Chen arrived Thursday afternoon for the first checkup, they showed her everything: the enclosure, the proximity to the nest, the evidence of the healthy eaglet bringing food. They showed her phone photos Caroline had taken, the two birds standing on opposite sides of the mesh, the fish being passed through, the adults watching from the branches above. Dr. Chen's professional composure cracked. "I've been doing raptor rehabilitation for 8 years, she said quietly, "and I've never seen anything like this. The level of social bonding, the problem-solving to maintain contact. This is extraordinary." She examined the injured bird thoroughly. The wing was healing well, no signs of infection or complications. She removed the restrictive bandage and replaced it with a lighter wrap that allowed more movement. "Time to start physical therapy," she announced. "The bird needs to exercise the wing, rebuild the muscle strength. It's going to be uncomfortable at first, but essential." She demonstrated the technique, gently extending and contracting the wing, working the joint through its range of motion, encouraging the bird to flap on its own. The eaglet tolerated it stoically, seeming to understand that this discomfort served a purpose. "Do this 3 times a day," Dr. Chen instructed. "Morning, midday, evening, 10 minutes each session. And watch for the bird to exercise on its own, hopping between perches, attempting to flap. That's the real rehabilitation." Thomas committed to the routine with the discipline of someone who'd spent a lifetime caring for animals. 3 times a day, he entered the enclosure with thick gloves and patient hands, working the healing wing while the eaglet fixed him with those fierce yellow eyes. It was delicate, exhausting work. Sometimes the bird resisted. Sometimes it seemed to lean into the therapy, understanding the goal. And always, always, the healthy sibling watched from above. The routine took shape over the following days. Morning therapy session, feeding, fresh fish Thomas bought in town or caught himself from the creek. Midday therapy, observation, evening therapy, then the night watch, when the healthy eaglet would often climb down to visit, to call through the mesh, to bring offerings of food. The adult eagles seemed to understand something unusual was happening. They hunted for both juveniles, dropping fish near the enclosure as well as in the nest. Sometimes Thomas would find 3 or 4 fish by the wire mesh in the morning. Provisions for the injured bird, brought by parents who refused to abandon either of their offspring. The community kept coming. Jim stopped by every few days, checking on progress. The Kowalski twins brought fresh straw for the enclosure floor. Sheriff Dawson's daughter, home from college for the weekend, spent an entire Saturday afternoon photographing the eagles for a research paper. Word spread beyond the valley. A reporter from the Billings newspaper called asking for an interview, but Thomas politely declined. This wasn't about publicity, this was about family. 2 weeks in, the injured eaglet made its first sustained flight. It was only 3 feet off the ground, only sustained for a few seconds before landing awkwardly on a perch. But Thomas let out a whoop of triumph that echoed across the valley. Caroline came running from the house, and they stood together watching the bird regain its balance, spread its wings experimentally, testing this newly remembered ability. "It's flying," Caroline said, wonder in her voice. "Tom, it's actually flying." From the nest above, the sibling called out, a sound Thomas chose to interpret as encouragement. 3 weeks in, the flights were longer, stronger, more controlled. The eaglet could fly from perch to perch, could gain altitude, could maneuver within the confines of the enclosure. Dr. Chen arrived for her weekly checkup and declared herself astounded by the progress. "This is ahead of schedule," she said, watching the bird execute a perfect landing. "The wing has healed remarkably well. I think we're looking at another 2, maybe 3 weeks before release." Thomas felt a complex mixture of joy and anxiety. Release meant success. It also meant risk. The eaglet would have to fend for itself, hunt, survive predators and weather and all the dangers of the wild. But more than that, release meant the end of this chapter. The end of these weeks spent in intimate connection with something wild and fierce and precious. "Will it remember us?" he asked Dr. Chen quietly. She smiled. "Eagles have excellent memories, especially for people associated with safety or food. But Tom, this bird isn't meant to remember you. It's meant to forget. It's meant to be wild, to fear humans, to survive in its own world. That's the ultimate success of rehabilitation." Thomas nodded, knowing she was right, still feeling the ache of impending separation. That night, he stood at the enclosure, watching the eaglet settle on its perch for sleep. Above, the healthy sibling was visible in the nest, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The adult eagles roosted nearby, a family divided, but not broken. "Soon," Thomas whispered. "Soon you'll all be together again, the way you're supposed to be." The injured eaglet looked at him with those fierce, intelligent eyes, and for just a moment Thomas felt seen, truly seen, by something utterly other and yet fundamentally familiar. Both creatures standing in the Montana darkness, both understanding something about loyalty and perseverance and the refusal to give up, both knowing that some bonds, once forged in crisis and care, last forever. The fourth week brought a cold snap that turned the morning grass white with frost. Thomas woke each day to a world crystallized and silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The injured eaglet was flying confidently now, powerful, controlled flights that took it from one end of the enclosure to the other, wings beating with the kind of strength that spoke of complete healing. Dr. Chen arrived on a Thursday morning with equipment Thomas didn't recognize: scales, measuring tape, a small video camera. She watched the eaglet fly for 20 minutes, recording every movement, making notes on a clipboard, with the focused intensity of a scientist documenting something remarkable. "The wing is perfect," she said finally, lowering the camera. "Full range of motion, no hesitation, no compensating. Medically speaking, this bird is ready for release." Thomas felt his stomach drop. How ready? "I want to do one more full examination. If everything checks out, weight, muscle tone, feather condition, we could release as early as this weekend." Caroline, standing beside Thomas, reached for his hand. "That's wonderful news." But her voice carried the same complex emotion Thomas felt. Joy and grief braided together, impossible to separate. Dr. Chen seemed to understand. "The hardest part of rehabilitation isn't the healing," she said gently. "It's the letting go. You've done something extraordinary here, both of you. But the whole point was to give this bird back its life, its real life. That time has come." She conducted the examination with her usual thoroughness. The eaglet cooperated, as if sensing the significance of the moment. Weight, perfect. Muscle development, excellent. Feathers, pristine. The wing that had hung broken and useless just 4 weeks ago, now extended and folded with fluid grace. "Saturday," Dr. Chen announced. "Dawn. That's the best time. The bird will have the whole day to orient itself, reconnect with its family, begin the adjustment." After she left, Thomas and Caroline stood by the enclosure in silence. The eaglet perched inside, preening its feathers with meticulous attention. Above, the healthy sibling was visible in the nest, larger now, its adult plumage beginning to show through the juvenile brown. The separation had lasted a month, a significant portion of these young birds' lives. Would they still recognize each other? Would the bond still hold? "We should do something special," Caroline said, "for the last couple of days, something to mark the end." Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure what she meant. "What do you do to commemorate the end of something you never expected to begin? How do you honor a relationship that shouldn't have existed, that defied the normal boundaries between human and wild?" That evening, they sat outside the enclosure with folding chairs and a thermos of coffee, simply watching. The eaglet moved through its routine, flying, perching, preening, eating the fish Thomas had brought. Normal behaviors for a bird that, by all rights, should have died in the grass during that storm. "I keep thinking about my father," Thomas said suddenly, "about what he said when he showed me the nest, about eagles choosing a place and sticking with it, about loyalty." Caroline looked at him, waiting. "I never really understood what he meant. I thought he was talking about tradition, or stubbornness, or just habit. But it's more than that, isn't it? It's about commitment, about deciding something matters and then proving it every single day. Like what you've done with this bird." "Like what that bird up there did," Thomas corrected, pointing toward the nest. "Climbing down every day, bringing food, refusing to forget. That's the real loyalty. That's what my father was trying to tell me." They sat until full darkness fell, until the eaglet settled for sleep and the stars emerged in brilliant profusion. The valley was quiet except for the eternal sounds: wind, distant cattle, the creek running cold and clear through the lower pasture. The same sounds Thomas had heard his entire life, suddenly precious in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Friday passed in a blur of preparation and avoidance. Thomas threw himself into farm work, fixing fences that didn't really need fixing, reorganizing the barn, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. Caroline baked bread, pies, cookies, filling the kitchen with warmth and the yeast-sweet smell of comfort. But both of them kept drifting back to the enclosure, unable to stay away for long. Jim Hutchins stopped by in the afternoon, ostensibly to return some tools, but really to see the eaglet one last time. He stood at the wire mesh, watching the bird fly, and shook his head in quiet amazement. "Never thought I'd see something like this," he said. "Never thought a bird could mean so much." "Neither did I," Thomas admitted. That night, Thomas made one final trip to the enclosure. The eaglet was awake, alert in the moonlight, its eyes catching and reflecting the silver glow. Thomas stood at the wire mesh, wanting to say something, needing to mark this ending. "You fought hard," he said quietly. "You fell, and the world should have ended right there. But you fought, and your sibling fought, and now you get to go home. You get your life back." His voice cracked. "I don't know if you'll remember any of this. Dr. Chen says you shouldn't, says you need to forget humans and be wild. But I'll remember every day what you taught me about not giving up, about family." The eaglet tilted its head, fixing Thomas with that intense, unblinking stare. For a long moment they regarded each other across the barrier that had protected and separated them for a month. Then the bird spread its wings, both wings perfect and symmetrical, and held them extended in the moonlight. It wasn't flying, wasn't moving, just displaying, showing what had been broken and was now whole. Thomas felt something break open in his chest. He raised his hand and pressed it against the wire mesh. The eaglet held its position for another moment, then folded its wings and returned to its perch. Acknowledgement. Farewell. Thank you. Thomas walked back to the farmhouse with tears on his face and peace in his heart. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear, the sun just beginning to touch the eastern ridge when Thomas and Caroline made their way to the enclosure. Dr. Chen was already there, having driven from Bozeman in the pre-dawn darkness. Sheriff Dawson had come too, and Jim Hutchins with his son Danny and the Kowalski twins. Word had spread somehow, the valley understanding that this moment needed witnesses. They gathered quietly around the enclosure as the light strengthened. Above, in the nest, both adult eagles were visible, and the healthy juvenile stood at the edge of the platform, looking down as if sensing something significant was about to happen. Dr. Chen turned to Thomas. "Are you ready?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Then you should be the one to open the gate. You found this bird, you saved it, you should be the one to let it go." Thomas approached the enclosure with his heart hammering. He'd opened this gate 100 times in the past month, to feed, to clean, to conduct therapy. But this time felt different, final, irrevocable. He unlatched the gate and pulled it wide. Then he stepped back, giving the eaglet clear passage to freedom. For a long moment, nothing happened. The bird stood on its perch, looking at the open gate, at Thomas, at the gathered humans. It seemed to be considering, calculating, perhaps feeling its own version of the complex emotions that gripped Thomas. Then it lifted off. The flight was powerful and direct. The eaglet burst from the enclosure with explosive energy, wings beating hard as it gained altitude. It climbed higher and higher, circling once, twice, 3 times above the gathered humans. Thomas craned his neck to watch, shielding his eyes against the rising sun. The bird called out, that piercing, triumphant cry, and from the nest came an answer. The healthy sibling launched itself into the air for the first time, its own maiden flight, drawn out by the return of its brother. The 2 eaglets met in mid-air, circling each other, calling back and forth in what could only be described as joy. They flew together, awkward still, juvenile birds testing their wings, but together. Finally, together. The adult eagles joined them, all 4 birds spiraling upward in a formation that looked almost choreographed. The family was whole again, complete, healed in ways that went beyond the physical. On the ground, no one spoke. Caroline was crying openly, her hand gripping Thomas's arm. Jim wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Even Sheriff Dawson, tough as old leather, stood with suspiciously bright eyes. Dr. Chen was recording everything with her camera, but her hands were shaking. The eagles climbed higher, becoming smaller against the vast Montana sky. They drifted toward the ridge, toward the pine tree, toward home. The injured eaglet. Thomas refused to think of it that way anymore. It was just an eaglet now, just a bird, just wild. Made one final circle above the farm. For a heartbeat, Thomas could have sworn it looked directly at him. One last acknowledgement across the divide, between human and wild, between the life that had been saved and the man who had saved it. Then it turned and flew toward the nest, toward its waiting family, toward the life it was always meant to live. Thomas watched until the birds were just specks against the sky, until they finally disappeared into the trees near the ridge. The valley was silent, except for the wind and the distant rush of the creek. "Well," Jim said finally, his voice rough, "I guess that's that." "Yeah," Thomas said, "that's that." But it wasn't. Not really. Something had changed in that month, in Thomas, in the valley, in the way the gathered neighbors looked at each other and the world around them. They'd witnessed something most people never see, the depth of connection possible between living things, the power of refusing to give up, the grace of healing. They'd seen a family torn apart by chance and brought back together by choice. As the group began to disperse, heading back to trucks and morning chores and the ordinary rhythms of life, Thomas stood alone by the empty enclosure. Caroline had gone to make breakfast for everyone, insisting they all come back to the house. Dr. Chen was packing up her equipment, but Thomas needed another moment. He looked up at the ridge, at the pine tree where the nest sat solid and eternal. Somewhere in those branches, 4 eagles were settling back into the patterns they'd been denied for a month, grooming, feeding, resting. A family reunited. "Thank you," Thomas whispered to the morning air, to the valley, to whatever force had brought that injured bird into his path and given him the chance to be part of something larger than himself. The wind answered, moving through the grass in waves that rolled toward the horizon like something alive. Thomas turned and walked back to the farmhouse, where coffee was brewing and friends were gathering and life was continuing in all its ordinary, extraordinary beauty. The enclosure would stay standing for a while. He'd dismantle it eventually, but not yet. For now, it stood as a monument to what was possible when compassion met determination, when family meant more than genetics, when the bond between living things proved stronger than the forces that tried to break them apart. A month ago, Thomas had been a farmer watching eagles through binoculars, admiring them from a distance. Now he was part of their story, and they were part of his. Forever connected by those weeks of struggle and healing, by the choice to save rather than surrender, by the fierce and tender work of putting broken things back together. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the frost. The valley came fully awake. And on the ridge, in the ancient pine tree, an eagle family settled in for the day. 4 birds where there had almost been only 3. Complete, whole, home. 3 weeks passed like water over stones, each day distinct, yet part of a larger flow. Thomas returned to the rhythms of farm life, but everything felt different now, changed. The morning chores carried a new awareness, a deeper attention to the world beyond his immediate tasks. He climbed the hill to the ridge every morning, binoculars in hand. The eagles were thriving. Both juveniles were flying confidently now, following their parents on hunting trips, learning the complex skills of survival. Thomas could no longer tell which one had been injured. They moved with equal grace, equal strength. The broken wing had healed completely, leaving no visible trace of those desperate days in September. But Thomas knew. He would always know. The bond between the siblings remained visible in small ways. They roosted close together in the nest at night, often touching. They practiced hunting together, diving in tandem at the creek, competing playfully for fish. When one made a kill, the other would call out in what Thomas had come to recognize as encouragement. The separation hadn't weakened them, it had done the opposite. Caroline noticed the change in her husband. He was quieter now, more reflective. He spent less time worrying about yields and markets and the 100 small concerns that usually occupied a farmer's mind. Instead, he watched the sky more, noticed the migrations beginning as autumn deepened, spoke with greater tenderness about the cattle, the land, the life they'd built. "You're different," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the western mountains. "I know. It's good. You're softer somehow, more present." Thomas considered this. "I think I'd forgotten," he said slowly, "what it means to really care about something, not in an abstract way, not as an idea, but as a living, breathing thing that depends on you. Those weeks with that bird, it was like remembering something I'd lost, or maybe learning it for the first time." Caroline took his hand. "Your father would be proud. I think he knew all along. That's why he kept bringing me up to see the nest. He was trying to teach me something about attention, about showing up, about the kind of loyalty that isn't dramatic or heroic, just daily, present, steady." The valley felt different too. Thomas noticed it in small interactions. Neighbors stopping to ask about the eagles, children being brought up to the ridge by their parents to see the nest, a new gentleness in how people spoke about the wildlife that shared their land. The story had spread through the community like ripples on water, changing something fundamental about how people saw their relationship to the wild things around them. Jim Hutchins had started a feeding program for injured deer on his property. The Kowalski twins were working with the local school to create an environmental education program. Sheriff Dawson's daughter was writing her thesis on eagle-sibling bonds and had cited Thomas's observations extensively. One life saved. One family reunited, and somehow imperceptibly a whole community transformed. On a crisp October morning, exactly 2 months after the storm, Thomas made his usual climb to the ridge. The aspens were golden now, shimmering in the breeze like coins catching sunlight. Winter was coming. He could smell it in the air, see it in the way the animals moved with greater urgency, storing and preparing. He raised the binoculars and found the nest. Both juveniles were there, their plumage almost fully mature now. In another few weeks, they'd begin to wander, exploring territories beyond the immediate valley. By spring, they might not return at all. Young eagles often traveled hundreds of miles before establishing their own territories. The separation that was coming was natural, necessary. It wouldn't diminish what had happened. If anything, it would complete it. As Thomas watched one of the juveniles, he chose to believe it was the one he'd saved, though he couldn't be certain, launched from the nest and flew directly toward him. His breath caught as the bird came closer, wings fully extended, riding the morning thermals with effortless grace. It passed directly overhead, no more than 30 feet above him, close enough that Thomas could see every detail. The fierce yellow eyes, the powerful talons. The wings that had once hung broken and were now perfect instruments of flight. The eagle called once, a sound Thomas felt in his chest, then banked and returned to the nest. He stood rooted to the spot, his heart hammering, unsure if what had just happened was coincidence or intention. Did the bird recognize him, remember him? Or was Thomas projecting human emotions onto a wild creature that had simply been flying and happened to pass close? It didn't matter. The moment was real, regardless of its interpretation. Thomas lowered the binoculars and looked out across the valley. His home. The place his grandfather had chosen, his father had maintained, and he had inherited. The land he'd one day pass to his children, whether they wanted it or not, because some things were worth preserving even if they were no longer valued. This land had shaped him. And in one small way, through one injured bird and 1 month of desperate care, he had shaped it back, had proven that the old bonds between human and animal, between family members separated by circumstance, between past and future, still held, still mattered. He thought about his father's words again. Eagles mate for life. They choose a partner and a place, and they stick with it. Thomas had chosen this place, this life. And despite the hardships, despite the isolation and the economic pressures and the knowledge that he was among the last of his kind, he didn't regret it, couldn't regret it. Not after witnessing what he'd witnessed, learning what he'd learned. Some things were worth the cost of loyalty. He walked back down the hill with the sun warm on his shoulders and peace in his heart. The farm awaited. Fences to mend, cattle to feed, the endless work of maintaining a life built on attention and care. But he walked lighter now, carrying something precious and invisible, the knowledge that broken things could heal, that families torn apart could be reunited, that the bonds between living things, human or animal, wild or domestic, were stronger and deeper than most people imagined, that sometimes in the midst of ordinary life you were given the chance to witness grace. And if you were paying attention, if you showed up with your whole heart, that grace would change you forever. That evening, Thomas and Carolyn sat on the porch as they had 1,000 times before. But tonight felt different, complete, like the ending of one chapter and the beginning of another. "What are you thinking about?" Caroline asked. Thomas smiled. "Eagles, always eagles." She laughed softly. "I think that bird marked you, Tom. I think you'll be thinking about eagles for the rest of your life." "Probably," he agreed. "But there are worse things to carry with you." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell over the valley. Above them stars began to emerge, first a few, then hundreds, then thousands, until the sky was alive with light. The same stars that had watched over this land for millennia, that would continue long after Thomas was gone. But for now, in this moment, he was here, present, alive to the beauty and the pain and the fierce, terrible joy of being connected to something larger than himself. On the ridge, 4 eagles settled in for the night, a family preserved, a bond unbroken, a testament to the power of refusing to give up, even when the odds seemed impossible. And in the farmhouse below, a man and woman held hands in the darkness, grateful for the unexpected gift they'd been given, the gift of witnessing what love looks like when it refuses to surrender, when it climbs down from safety to search for what was lost, when it brings food to the fallen and waits, patient and faithful, for healing to come. The valley breathed around them, eternal and patient, and somewhere in the darkness an eagle dreamed of flight. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever witnessed or lived something like this.